They didn't fight with swords because they were brave. They fought with swords because they had no other choice. That image burned into the modern imagination, the lone warrior, blade gleaming, standing at the center of the battlefield, is not entirely wrong. But it is dangerously incomplete. Because before that warrior ever raised his weapon, before the first clash of iron on iron ever split the morning air, there was a world of fire, sweat, knowledge, and years of labor that made that blade possible. And understanding that world changes everything, including how we read certain passages in Scripture that most people skim past without a second thought. What did it actually cost to own a sword in the ancient world? Who made them? How long did it take? And why, at a very specific moment in history, did all of that hard-won craftsmanship suddenly stop mattering on the battlefield? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels, and why the world Jesus walked into was a world already being reshaped by a new kind of violence. The story begins not in a palace armory or a royal forge, but in a small, soot-darkened workshop on the edge of a provincial town. Picture it, a low stone building, its single entrance facing away from the wind. Inside, the heat is immediate and physical. Not the warmth of a hearth, something deeper, pressing against the skin like a hand. The charcoal burns at the center of a clay furnace, fed by a bellows worked by a boy no older than 12, his arms moving in a slow, practiced rhythm. The smell is iron and char and something faintly sulfuric. The sound is a low roar beneath everything, punctuated by the sharp ring of a hammer. The smith stands over his anvil. He is not young. His forearms are mapped with old burned scars, not from carelessness, but from decades of proximity to temperatures that human skin was never meant to tolerate. He knows iron the way a farmer knows soil, by color, by texture, by the way it responds to pressure at different heats. A piece of iron glowing orange behaves differently than one glowing white. Strike it wrong and it cracks. Let it cool a degree too far and the work is lost. There are no thermometers here. There are no written guides. There is only the eye, trained over years, and the hand, trained over more years still. This is where weapons were born. Not in factories. Not in standardized molds. In the minds and hands of individuals who carried their knowledge the way priests carried scripture, memorized, embodied, irreplaceable. And if you think the tools hanging on that workshop wall were simple, if you imagine that producing a functional iron blade was merely a matter of heating and hammering, you are about to discover how deeply wrong that assumption is. If you find this kind of deep historical reconstruction valuable, consider subscribing. This channel exists to bring the ancient world back to life, one forgotten detail at a time. To understand why weapon crafting mattered so profoundly in the ancient world, you first have to understand what iron actually is, and what it is not. Iron ore comes out of the ground as rock. Dense, reddish, utterly useless in its raw form. Transforming it into a functional blade required a process called smelting, in which the ore was heated to temperatures exceeding 1100 degrees Celsius, hot enough to separate the metal from the stone matrix surrounding it. But even that was only the beginning. The iron that emerged from a basic smelt was brittle, inconsistent, full of impurities. It bent when it should hold. It snapped when it should flex. A spear tip made from poorly processed iron could shatter on first contact with a shield. The difference between iron that failed and iron that held was carbon. Specifically, the precise and controlled introduction of carbon into the metal during the forging process, a technique we now call carburization, though the smiths of the ancient world had no such word for it. They simply knew, through long experience, that certain methods of heating and working the metal produced a harder, more reliable result. They knew which charcoals burned hotter. They knew how long to keep the blade in the fire. They knew how to quench, plunging the heated metal into water or oil at exactly the right moment, and they knew that quenching too early or too late produced entirely different results. This knowledge was not written down. In most ancient cultures, it was passed from master to apprentice over years of direct, physical instruction. A skilled smith in 1st century Judea, in Rome, in Persia, in Greece, carried within him a library of technique that no scroll could adequately capture. His hands knew things his words could not fully explain. And it took time. Producing a single quality iron sword, from raw ore to finished, battle-ready blade, could take weeks of sustained labor. A trained swordsmith might produce only a handful of high-quality blades per year. Each one was individual. Each one reflected the specific knowledge, the specific habits, the specific corrections and improvements accumulated by one human being over a lifetime. This is why weapons were expensive. Not simply because the raw materials cost money, though they did. But because the knowledge required to transform those materials was rare, slow to produce, and impossible to replicate quickly. A sword was not merely a piece of iron. It was a crystallization of years of human intelligence, embodied in metal. In the world Jesus moved through, weapons carried that weight. When a Roman soldier was equipped, the cost of his kit, his gladius, his pilum, his armor, represented an enormous investment. That equipment was maintained carefully, repaired when damaged, passed down when possible. A broken blade was not simply discarded. It was taken back to the smith, assessed, reworked if salvageable, and mourned if not. The ordinary person, the farmer, the fisherman, the day laborer in Galilee, lived at an enormous distance from all of this. Weapons were not part of their daily existence. But the men who carried weapons moved through their world constantly. Roman soldiers stationed throughout Judea were a permanent, visible, inescapable presence. Their equipment represented a technology and an organization that the local population could not match. And that gap, between the armed and the unarmed, between the equipped and the vulnerable, created a particular kind of tension that saturated daily life in ways we rarely stop to examine. There is a moment described in the Gospel of Matthew that most readers pass through in seconds. A Roman soldier approaches a man on the road and compels him to carry his pack for 1 mile. It is presented almost as a footnote, a brief, incidental detail in the middle of a longer teaching. But stop there for a moment. Hold that scene still and look at it through the lens of everything we have just established. That soldier was carrying equipment. Not symbolic equipment, real, functional, heavy gear. A Roman legionary on the march could be burdened with a pack weighing 30 kilograms or more, in addition to his weapons and armor. The right to compel a civilian to carry that load for 1 Roman mile, roughly 1,500 meters, was embedded in Roman law. It was called the system of angaria, the requisition of labor, and it was not a rare abuse. It was policy. Codified, legal, and routine. The man compelled to carry that pack had no recourse. Refusal was not a realistic option. The soldier standing before him was equipped with weapons produced by exactly the kind of skilled, expensive, irreplaceable craftsmanship we have been describing. The civilian carried nothing comparable. The gap between them was not merely legal or social, it was material, physical, and absolute. And into that specific tension, into that exact power imbalance, Jesus speaks. Not with a call to rebellion. Not with a command to submit in silence. But with something stranger and more destabilizing than either: go 2 miles. Carry it a second mile. Voluntarily. Of your own choice. To a first-century Jewish audience living under Roman occupation, those words were not gentle encouragement. They were a radical reframing of power itself. Because in that world, the ability to compel was the clearest visible sign of superiority. The soldier compelled because he could. That was the entire logic of Roman military presence, the constant, embodied demonstration that resistance was futile. But a man who chooses to carry the pack a second mile has done something the soldier did not authorize and cannot fully control. He has stepped outside the structure of compulsion. He has introduced agency into a situation designed to eliminate it. The act of going the second mile was not submission. It was, in the most concrete and material sense, a refusal to be fully defined by the power standing over him. Jesus was not speaking in abstractions. He was speaking to people who had felt the weight of that pack on their shoulders. Who knew the particular humiliation of being stopped on the road, of having their plans interrupted, of carrying another man's burden under a sky they shared but did not equally own. Meanwhile, back in the forge, something was changing. The same Roman military machine that depended on skilled smiths to produce its weapons was beginning to develop processes that would, over time, reduce that dependency. Larger, more centralized production facilities, what historians would later call fabrici, were beginning to standardize weapon manufacture. Not perfectly. Not immediately. But the direction was clear. The era in which a single master smith's knowledge could determine the outcome of battles was quietly giving way to something else. Something that would eventually make individual craftsmanship almost irrelevant on the field of war. And that shift, slow, grinding, and largely invisible to those living through it, was already underway in the world Jesus inhabited. The transition happened gradually, and then all at once. For centuries, the quality of a fighting force depended in meaningful part on the quality of its individual weapons, and the quality of those weapons depended on the knowledge of the men who made them. A city with access to 3 master smiths was militarily different from a city with none. A general who could equip his soldiers with properly carbonized, well-quenched iron blades held an advantage over one whose men carried brittle, inconsistent weapons that shattered under sustained combat pressure. Skill was a strategic resource. It could be cultivated, protected, stolen, or destroyed. But Rome, in its relentless organizational logic, began to solve a problem that previous civilizations had accepted as unsolvable. The problem was this: skilled craftsmen were slow. They were individual. They were mortal. And their knowledge died with them if not carefully transmitted. An empire that depended on rare individuals for its weapons was an empire with a fundamental vulnerability built into its military foundation. The answer was systematization. The imperial fabrici, large state-run weapons production facilities, began to distribute the process. A single smith no longer needed to know every stage of production. One man heated the iron. Another hammered the rough shape. Another refined the edge. Another fitted the hilt. Each task was narrower, more repetitive, more teachable in a fraction of the time. A worker could be trained to perform one stage competently in weeks rather than years. The knowledge was no longer concentrated in one person. It was spread across a system. The result was a weapon that was, in most cases, slightly inferior to what a true master smith could produce alone. But it was produced faster, in larger quantities, at low cost per unit, with far less dependency on irreplaceable human expertise. And on a battlefield where thousands of soldiers clashed in formation, where tactics and logistics and sheer numbers determined outcomes far more than the quality of any individual blade, that trade-off was entirely rational. Individual mastery had not become worthless. But it had become strategically secondary. This is the world in which the first followers of Jesus lived and died. A world where the old logic, that excellence, skill, and years of hard-won knowledge guaranteed position and protection, was being systematically dismantled by a new logic of scale, organization, and replaceable function. The skilled smith did not disappear overnight. But the world was no longer being built around him. And yet, in the teachings moving through that same world, a different set of values was being articulated with equal force. Not the value of systemic efficiency. Not the value of scale. But the irreducible value of the individual, the one lost sheep, the one lost coin, the one son who had wandered and returned. In a world increasingly organized around the replaceable, Jesus spoke obsessively about the irreplaceable. That is not a coincidence born of abstract theology. It is a response to a concrete historical condition. The people listening to those teachings knew what it felt like to be made redundant by systems larger than themselves. They knew what it meant to carry skills that the world was beginning to value less. They knew the particular loneliness of expertise that no longer guaranteed security. When Jesus told his followers that not one sparrow falls without the Father knowing it, In a world where Roman logistics were reducing human beings to interchangeable units of labor and military function, those words landed on people who desperately needed to hear exactly that. That they were seen. That they were known. That the same precision and care that a master smith poured into a single blade was being poured, invisibly and constantly, into each of them. The forge has gone cold now. The master smith is gone. But the questions his work raises have not gone anywhere at all. If this journey into the world of Jesus strengthened your faith or changed how you read the Gospels, if you saw something today you had never seen before, consider leaving a like, sharing this video with someone you love, and subscribing so you never miss what we uncover next. Every video on this channel exists to bring the biblical world back to life, one detail at a time.